So, James, two of our favourite topics on this podcast. One of them is bat tunnels. Of course, we're big fans of bat tunnels, at least from a content perspective. And the other is how institutions seem to be conspiring and working their hardest to elect a reform government in 2029 through
We're a cheery pod,
sheer...
Martin.
Exactly. We like to keep you entertained on a Monday morning. So here's a story that neatly combines both of these things because, James, it turns out that a reform-led council in Lincolnshire is actually building a bat tunnel, much to their own surprise, and they're really not very happy about it.
Is this one of those reform councils that's like led by a 12-year-old or something who's been put in charge of enormous like social care budgets they don't understand?
No, I think it's actually run by an adult. He's called Sean Matthews, and according to the footage that I've seen, at least he looks like a reasonably old man, although, you never know. But essentially, the project in question is called the North Hykeham Relief Road, which confusingly is a £200 million dual carriageway that's being built to the south of Lincoln. And it got funded by Labour in part due to their big infrastructure push earlier this year. Government's paying about half of it, and the council are chipping in another 75 million or so. So it's a pretty massive project for Lincolnshire County Council. Now, the great philosopher Beyonce once said, if you like it, then you should have put a ring on it. And that's exactly what Lincolnshire County Council are trying to do with this road. For over 2 decades, they've been trying to build a ring road around their city in order to reduce traffic and congestion in various suburbs and allow vehicles to move from places like Skegness and other towns around Lincoln. And the North Hykeham Relief Road, it's like the very last section of it. Once they've built it, they've actually completed transport in Lincoln. It's literally the last major piece of infrastructure on their local transport plan.
Martin, we've covered Lincolnshire's infrastructure needs a lot on this podcast. There's someone in Lincolnshire listening. He must be delighted that this pod is specifically for them. But Martin, from what you're saying, I'm guessing that something must have gone horribly wrong because you say they're now building a bat tunnel. And we know from HS2 that those are pretty bad. So what's happened?
Yeah, the bat tunnel is the final level of all infrastructure, I think. And what happened in this case is sometime in 2023, a man in a field holding an acoustic receiver detected a bat. And it wasn't just any bat, it was a Barber-style bat. And now I have lots of thoughts on how these surveys are done, and I'm elaborating on them in the Substack post that is coming out at the same time as this podcast. So there's a little plug for that. But assuming that these surveys are accurate, this is a really big deal. So there are 17 species of bats in the UK, James. I appreciate our listeners aren't tuning in for an ecology discussion or lecture, but just for context. 2 of those bat species are especially rare, and they're subject to very, very strict protections. And one of those is the Barber-style bat. And this is a particularly gnarly bat because it's already been responsible for a bypass being cancelled in Norwich, which was pretty bad news for Alan Partridge, obviously.
Sorry, the entire road was completely cancelled because of a bat?
Almost, yeah. So the Norwich bypass was in the works for years. Much like Lincolnshire, they had massive ambitions to build bypasses around Norwich to improve traffic. This was a crucial piece of that, and they were in consultation with Natural England for nearly 4 years, when suddenly in March last year, the rules on this specific bat were changed. It was given much more protection by Natural England, and it turns out there's a colony of them on the route that the road is supposed to take. And so suddenly, after literally 4 years of talking to Natural England, the council had just told in March, nope, actually you can't do it. And in January this year, they had to finally withdraw the plans. Now, they've been able to bring them back to the table since, so they're getting it going again, and hopefully the road will still go ahead. But they're now 5 years into this saga of trying to figure out how to basically deal with this bat.
Martin, you're making me think, why do Al-Qaeda bother trying to kill people? Why don't they just get a whole bunch of bats and just release them and paralyze us that way and try and achieve their aims that way? But
yeah, I think if the Russians just introduced a new rare bat species, they'd cause havoc across the kingdom.
Okay, Martin, so this is obviously an insane story. So I guess if you're a developer on any other road, then you're going to be pretty paranoid about bats being a problem.
Right, exactly. So the development in Lincolnshire, the North Hykeham Relief Road, is being led by the Highways Department at Lincolnshire County Council. And obviously, they're going to want to talk to Natural England as early as possible and make sure that they've got everything squared away, which is what they did. And allegedly, this is what resulted in the requirement for a bat tunnel and a bat bridge, James, on the road.
Hang on, Martin. What did you mean by allegedly there? I just want to emphasize for any lawyers listening, Martin made this allegation and I definitely did not.
Well, but this is where it gets really weird, because both the Reform Council leader and the Conservative opposition leader point the finger squarely at Natural England. They say that Natural England were responsible for this advice and for essentially coming up with this necessity for a bat bridge and a bat tunnel. But when the BBC asked Natural England, they said they've got nothing to do with the proposal. They'd not offered any advice. The developer came up with the plans themselves based on ecological surveys, and Natural England, we were never consulted. And now that's a little bit awkward, because the developer in this case, as I say, is Lincolnshire Highways Department. And here's Sam Richards, who is the head of the Highways Department, talking about the process at a recent council meeting.
So we spoke to Natural England rather than trying to sort of go with it. We actually spoke to the people as part of the process to say, what is the reasonable level of mitigation? Obviously, you go into that with a level of trepidation when you see some of the things that I'm sure we've all seen in the press with the HS2 and £1 billion on the bat tunnel. Are we getting into this kind of process? I have to say the conversation was far more pragmatic and proportionate to the flight paths that we have. And we actually have 5 or 6 flight paths at different locations across the route, and each of them having slightly different mitigation depending on the intensity.
Martin, this is just making me more confused.
Yeah, exactly. So, we don't have lawyers on this podcast, so I'm not going to start speculating about motives or, why people have responded the way that they did. But there's clearly a discrepancy here between what the Highways Department, who, just to remind listeners that these are not political people. This is effectively the local civil servants who are working on this. They're professionals. They're used to kind of doing this stuff and working with bodies like Natural England. And they say they've consulted with Natural England, and Natural England are saying, nope, we don't know anything about it. So God knows what's going on there. But what at least is clear is that unless they do something about the bats to help protect bats that are around the road is not going to go ahead.
So what's the plan, Martin? I guess importantly, is building this bat tunnel, which I'm sure Reform are loving. What is it going to cost?
So the plan, as I say, is for a bat green bridge and a bat tunnel to be built. And it's fair to say that the idea of a bat bridge and a bat tunnel have challenged the imagination of the new councillors. Here's the Conservative opposition leader trying to wrap his head around the projects in the same council meeting.
I'd also like to know, in terms of the remedial measures you've been asked to put in, I'm assuming by Natural England, one of the great Tony Blair legacy arrangements, I'm guessing we don't have any choice, that we either have to do what they say or they will just stop this scheme going ahead. But what's the measure of effectiveness of these things? I mean, how do you, dare I ask, direct a bat through a tunnel? I mean, I can't even believe I'm asking the question, candidly. But I think it should be asked, with respect.
Traffic lights.
I mean, you can't put up a sign, because maybe Braille, I don't know. But they can't see, can they? So
thank you, Councillor Davis.
Sorry, I'll end there.
If you can answer that question, you'll be doing well.
Martin, it's weirdly fascinating how, despite Reform being in charge of the council and having beaten them, and the Conservatives are now in opposition, they seem basically to completely agree on all of this stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of striking that they're all sort of having a laugh together. And I think one thing I find quite fascinating about this is I can't help thinking it speaks to Reform having a much better media operation than the Tories. So the Tories were dealing with exactly the same issues for the last year or so, but it's the new Reform councillors who've managed to highlight this and are making a big noise and bringing this to the attention of the BBC. And I really think that says something about how well they're doing on a campaigning front. But anyway, leaving that aside, the bat tunnel is a bit misleading. So what these actually are an underpass and an overpass for hedgerows. So the point here is that bats navigate along hedgerows. If you imagine at night, like if you're looking at the ground from up in the air, there's all the sort of pale fields, and between them there's these dark lines of hedgerows, and that's what bats follow when they're moving around and trying to hunt stuff. And if you imagine a big dual carriageway or a road that's sort of cutting through a hedgerow and severing it in the middle, the bats are obviously going to fly along the hedgerow at quite a low level, and then they're going to hit the gap, and then they're going to go splat into the side of a lorry or something. So it's not ideal. So the idea here is that you make like a little bridge or a culvert, and the hedge basically just continues over or under the road. The bats follow it as usual in theory, and everything's fine, except it's going to cost you about £4.3 million to answer your question.
Martin, am I crazy, or does that not actually sound too bad in terms of money? I mean, 4.3 million out of a budget of, what did you say, 200 million for the road? That's basically a rounding error, and this is a nice thing to do for the bats.
Yeah, and not just for the bats, right? I mean, I'm kind of in favor of this in general. Like, hedgerows are massively important for wildlife. I know where you live, James, in urban reaches of Greater London, you don't really have wildlife or countryside or ever see anything green. But here in the countryside, you know, we understand that there is a thing called wildlife. It moves around. It needs to get from A to B, and hedgerows are a great way for it to do that. And they're important for connecting different ecosystems and stopping Britain's land from being completely fragmented to nature. And so I'm kind of in favor of them, but that's not why they're being built. They're being built for a specific species of bat. And that's where I think we come to the next problem, James.
Let me guess. Do these species of bats, do they not like bat tunnels or bat hedgerows or whatever we're calling them now?
So yeah, let's come to the question of, do these actually work? This is the £4 million question, right? So earlier I mentioned Norwich. Norwich have been wrestling with bats for years now. It seems to be a weird thing in Norwich that basically they're the front line of the war with the Barber-style bats, maybe because they're closest to Russia. Who knows? But conspiracy theories aside, so recently Norfolk County Council installed bat bridges and other bat infrastructure. They built gantries over an A road at a cost of £1 million that were designed that bats would kind of think that they were a hedgerow and follow them. And a report was leaked to the BBC recently that showed that the bats basically ignored them completely. One green bridge that they built, they did surveys there. They had sightings of just 13 bats, 13 bats. And in fact, a lot of this was put in place again because of the Barber-style bats that they were most concerned about. And the colony of those that were there just moved out of the area, apparently.
So is this like when I buy my cats a lovely new cat tree to stand on or play with, and they don't care and they just want to sit in the old plastic bag instead, something like that?
Yeah, exactly. It's like however much money you've spent on it, completely wasted because they'd rather just jump in a cardboard box or something. And here's the thing, right? So these bats hate noise and light and human disruption. They are famously elusive. Yeah, exactly. Me too, right? Perhaps unlike you, they're much happier in quiet, peaceful woodland. I feel like that's a bit of a stretch, not really our natural environment. But so why would they be going near a busy 70-mile-an-hour dual carriageway full of bright headlights in the first place?
So there's basically no way to mitigate the harm to these bats from building this road, then, is what you're saying?
Well, there kind of is, and it comes back to what Yimbys have been saying about bat tunnels and other wildlife preserving infrastructure all along, which is if you want to spend £4 million or £10 million or £100 million specifically to conserve a species of bats like the Barber-stals, you would be much better off investing it in a proper conservation effort, doing something like building £4 million worth of woodlands that they can actually live in and that provides habitat and roosting spots and restoring hedgerows across the countryside and so on. That would make much more sense than building green bridges across random sections of A road, even though, like I said, in general, I'm still very much in favour of preserving hedgerows where possible, right?
And I guess what you're saying as well, that this is basically a massive gift for reform. If a council can't build a road because of some bats, well, that's just going straight on the poster, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's incredible. So not only have Natural England made themselves the villain yet again with both the original policy and also the communication around it, which is wildly confusing, but they're painting a massive target on their backs if reform ever managed to take power in Westminster. So the council leader there, Sean Matthews, is already talking about getting the local MP to raise this issue in Parliament. It's clearly something that they're able to campaign on and make a big noise about. It's the perfect exemplar for them of bureaucracy gone mad and Britain drowning in red tape and we can't even build a road anymore. And I think we sort of underestimate the possibility that if reform take power, they could do quite drastic things with very few checks and balances on them, right? So they could just defund Natural England completely and disband the organisation and remove a whole bunch of those environmental protections. And I think if Westminster pundits could get away from doing pointless reporting on reshuffles that don't really matter other than to the people involved, and they actually look outside the M25 a bit, they'd see that this is the playbook that is being written now for if or when reform take power. And it is a very effective playbook at getting media attention, much more effective than the Tories were up there previously. And as much as I know we criticise Natural England, they do exist for a reason. There is a purpose. Like, we should want to protect bats. We should want to protect wildlife when we build new infrastructure. And it's great that we consider things like green corridors and hedgerows when we're putting down new roads and new railways. I know often the criticism of the abundance agenda is, you just want to build stuff everywhere and you don't care about regulations or the environment. But I think what we've always said is actually the current system is not great for protecting those things anyway. And we can do a lot better, not just for building stuff, but for bats and, dare I say, other animals, whatever they may be as well. But we're stuck with this system that is insane. It is horrendously opaque. It's very hard to find actually detailed information even on what surveys were done or what bats were found. Developers are stuck in this sort of constant state of fear and uncertainty where every time they have a meeting, it might lead to a 3-year delay, and it doesn't necessarily protect the bats anyway. And I think the danger is that unless there is a much needed reform of quangos like Natural England and how they operate and the culture there, going beyond the planning reforms that we've seen so far, we could just see wholesale destruction of environmental protection in a few years' time if reform take power, and that would be a really bad thing.
Well, that's a depressing note to end on, Martin. Let's hope that the next segment is a bit cheerier.